It was a crisp autumn evening, and the streets of Oakridge buzzed with life. The golden glow of streetlights reflected on damp pavements as laughter and chatter echoed from nearby cafes. Amidst the bustle, 12-year-old Jamal strolled down the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his faithful dog, Max, trotting happily beside him. Max, a German shepherd with sharp, intelligent eyes, was more than a pet to Jamal. He was a protector, a confidant, and above all, family. Jamal had spent the day helping out at the local animal shelter, a place he loved because of his bond with animals. Max had been by his side every step of the way, wagging his tail as the younger kids giggled and played with the puppies. The boy and his dog were inseparable, their connection built on trust, loyalty, and years of shared moments. As they turned the corner to head home, Jamal felt the faint chill of a breeze on his face. The streets had grown quieter, and the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the buildings. A soft hum of an approaching car drifted through the air, and Max's ears perked up. Jamal chuckled. "Always on alert, huh, buddy?" Unbeknownst to Jamal, someone had been watching him. A man, lurking in the shadows near a parked van, had noticed the boy earlier in the day. He was lean and shifty, his face partially obscured by a hoodie that seemed too large for him. His eyes darted around nervously as he sized up his target, young, alone, and seemingly unaware. Perfect. Jamal was oblivious to the looming danger as he reached into his backpack for a small treat for Max. "Here you go, Max," he said, holding out the treat. Max wagged his tail, but his gaze was fixed on the van. A low, almost imperceptible growl rumbled in his throat. Suddenly, the man stepped out of the shadows. "Hey there, kid," he called, his voice slick with feigned friendliness. Jamal froze for a moment, unsure whether to respond. His mom had always told him not to talk to strangers, but the man didn't look particularly threatening at first glance. Max's growl grew louder, and Jamal instinctively moved closer to his dog. "Hi," he replied hesitantly, gripping Max's leash a little tighter. "You dropped something back there," the man said, pointing to the ground a few feet behind Jamal. The boy frowned and turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back. It was all the man needed. In an instant, he lunged forward, grabbing the strap of Jamal's backpack and yanking it off his shoulder. "Hey, stop!" Jamal shouted, stumbling backward as Max barked ferociously. The man was fast, faster than Jamal expected. He sprinted down the street, clutching the backpack like a prize. But he'd made a crucial mistake. He had underestimated Max. Without hesitation, Max bolted after the man, his powerful legs propelling him like a missile. Jamal, still stunned, shouted, "Max, come back." But the dog was locked onto his target, his loyalty to Jamal driving him forward. The man glanced back, his face twisting in fear as he saw the determined German shepherd closing the gap. "Stupid mutt," he muttered, trying to pick up his pace. But Max was relentless, his sharp barks echoing through the empty streets. Jamal's heart raced as he watched the chase unfold. He knew Max was strong, but what if the man hurt him? What if Max got lost? A mix of fear and anger surged through him, and he began to run after them, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. The thief turned down a narrow alley, hoping to lose the dog. The alley was dimly lit, with towering walls that seemed to close in on him. But Max wasn't deterred. His sharp senses guided him through the twists and turns, his barks growing louder and more intimidating. Finally, the man reached the end of the alley, only to find a tall chain-link fence blocking his escape. He cursed under his breath, spinning around to face his pursuer. Max skidded to a stop a few feet away, his teeth bared and a deep growl rumbling from his chest. The thief tried to act tough, waving the backpack like a shield. "Back off, dog." But Max didn't back down. He took a step closer, his growl intensifying. The man's bravado faltered as fear crept into his eyes. He didn't know much about dogs, but he could tell this one wasn't buffing. By the time Jamal arrived at the alley's entrance, he was out of breath. He could see Max standing his ground, the thief cornered with nowhere to go. "Max!" Jamal called, his voice trembling with relief. The dog glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting Jamal's before returning to the man. The tension in the air was palpable. Jamal's mind raced with questions. What would the man do next? Would Max be okay? And more importantly, how were they going to get out of this situation? Jamal's chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. The alley seemed even darker now, the walls looming ominously on either side. His eyes flicked between Max, who stood firm and ready to defend, and the man clutching his backpack like it was the last thing he'd ever hold. The man's face was pale under the dim streetlight at the alley's end, his fear evident as Max edged closer, growling low and steady. Jamal took a cautious step forward. "Just give it back," he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice cracked slightly, but he hoped the man didn't notice. "You can go. I don't care. Just give me my stuff." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted to the fence behind him, then back to Max. Beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. He was trapped, and he knew it. Slowly, he raised his hands, the backpack dangling from his grip. "Listen, kid," he started, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I just needed some cash, all right." Jamal frowned. Cash. What could the man possibly want with his backpack? It was filled with school books, a water bottle, and maybe a few snacks. Nothing valuable. Nothing worth stealing. The thought made his anger flare. "There's nothing in there for you," Jamal said firmly. "Just give it back. Please." Max let out a sharp bark, and the man flinched, almost dropping the bag. He glanced down at the dog, then back at Jamal. "Call them off," the man demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence of someone in control. "Just call him off, and I'll give it back." Jamal hesitated. Max was his safety net right now, the only thing standing between him and whatever this man was capable of. But he also didn't want Max to get hurt. The dog was brave, sometimes too brave, and Jamal knew he'd protect him at all costs. "Max," he called softly, his tone steady but commanding. "Stay." Max didn't move. His growl softened, but his stance remained firm, eyes locked on the man. It was as if he understood the tension of the moment, the delicate balance between danger and resolution. The man took a deep breath, then slowly lowered the backpack to the ground. His hands trembled as he set it down, inching back against the fence. "There," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's yours. Just take it." Jamal wanted to rush forward and grab it, but something held him back. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The man's eyes were too shifty, his movements too calculated. Max seemed to sense it too, his ears twitching as he stayed on high alert. "What's in the bag?" Jamal asked suddenly, his voice sharper now. The question caught the man off guard, and he hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the right words. "I didn't touch anything," the man stammered. "It's just books and stuff, right? That's all. I didn't even look." Jamal's suspicion deepened. Something wasn't adding up. If the man was just after money, why had he targeted Jamal? Why follow a kid with nothing valuable? And why was he so nervous now? "Then why'd you take it?" Jamal pressed, stepping closer. Max followed suit, his growl returning. The man shook his head, his back pressed firmly against the fence. "It was a mistake," he muttered. "Wrong place, wrong time. That's all." Jamal didn't believe him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. Maybe the man thought he had something valuable in the bag, something worth risking this confrontation for. But what? And why was he so desperate now that he was caught? Before Jamal could ask another question, a sudden noise broke the silence. A faint rustling from the shadows deeper in the alley. Max's head snapped toward the sound, and his growl grew louder. Jamal's stomach tightened as he turned to look. Was someone else there? "Who's there?" Jamal called, his voice trembling slightly. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. Max took a step forward, his body tense as he prepared for whatever might come next. The man seized the distraction as his opportunity. With a burst of movement, he shoved past Jermel, nearly knocking him over, and bolted toward the street. "Max, stop him!" Jermel yelled, but the dog hesitated, torn between chasing the man and guarding his owner. By the time Max decided to give chase, the man had disappeared around the corner, his footsteps echoing into the night. Jermel stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The backpack still lay on the ground, untouched. Max returned moments later, his tail low and his expression apologetic. Jermel knelt down, placing a hand on Max's head. "It's okay, boy," he whispered. "You did good." He reached for the bag, his fingers trembling slightly as he unzipped it. Everything seemed to be in place: his books, his water bottle, his snacks. But as he rummaged through the contents, his hand brushed against something he didn't recognize. He pulled it out slowly, his breath catching in his throat. It was a small black pouch, sealed tightly with a zipper. Jermel didn't remember putting it in his bag, and it certainly wasn't something he owned. He glanced at Max, who tilted his head as if to say, "What's that?" Jermel hesitated. Part of him wanted to open it right then and there, but another part of him was afraid of what he might find. Why would the man risk so much for this? And how had it ended up in his bag? A shiver ran down his spine as he tucked the pouch back into the bag. He needed answers, but he also needed to get home. His mom would be worried if he was out too late, and he didn't want to explain why he'd been running through dark alleys chasing a thief. "Come on, Max," he said, slinging the bag over his shoulder. The dog trotted beside him as they made their way back to the main street. But the unease lingered, the weight of the pouch pressing against his thoughts. By the time they reached home, the sky had turned a deep indigo, stars peeking through the thin veil of clouds. Jermel's mom greeted him at the door, her warm smile quickly replaced by concern when she saw his flushed face and dirt-streaked clothes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. Jermel hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "Just a long day," he said, forcing a smile. "I'm okay." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go, ushering him inside. Max padded in after him, his tail wagging as he plopped down on his favorite rug. Jermel headed straight to his room, shutting the door behind him. He set the backpack on his bed and pulled out the pouch, staring at it for a long moment. His fingers hovered over the zipper, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it money? Jewelry? Something illegal? The questions swirled in his head, each one more unsettling than the last. Finally, he took a deep breath and opened it. Jermel's hands trembled as he unzipped the small black pouch. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Max sat by the bed, his sharp eyes watching Jermel's every move as if he, too, sensed the weight of this moment. The pouch opened easily, revealing its contents: a neatly folded piece of paper, a small USB drive, and what looked like a crumpled photograph. Jermel frowned, his heart thudding in his chest. These weren't the things he expected to find. No cash, no valuables, nothing that would explain why the man had risked so much for it. Carefully, he unfolded the paper first. It was covered in small, neat handwriting, but the words didn't make sense to him. A series of numbers and letters were scribbled across the page, like some kind of code. He tilted his head, trying to decipher it, but it was no use. It might as well have been written in another language. Next, he picked up the USB drive. It was plain and unmarked, just a simple black stick. Jermel stared at it, wondering what could possibly be on it. His curiosity grew, but he knew plugging it into his computer could be risky. What if it had a virus? Or worse, what if it led to something dangerous? Finally, Jermel turned his attention to the photograph. It was creased and smudged, but he could make out the image: a man and a woman standing in front of a small house. The man had a serious expression, his sharp features shadowed by the poor quality of the print. The woman, on the other hand, looked kind, her gentle smile radiating warmth. In her arms was a little boy, no older than 3. Jamal stared at the boy, noticing how his curly hair and big brown eyes reminded him of someone. But who? Max whined softly, breaking Jamal's focus. The dog nudged his hand with his nose, as if urging him to do something. "I know, Max," Jamal muttered, setting the photo down. "This is weird, really weird." Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in something far bigger than he understood. The man who had stolen his backpack hadn't been just some random thief. He'd been after this pouch, these items. But why? And how had it ended up in Jamal's bag in the first place? His mind raced with possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. Was it some kind of mistake? Or had someone put it there on purpose? He glanced at the USB drive again, his curiosity gnawing at him. Finally, he couldn't resist. Pulling his laptop from his desk, he powered it on and plugged in the drive. Max perked up, watching intently as Jamal opened the file explorer. The drive loaded quickly, revealing a single folder labeled Asterisk Project Sentinel. Asterisk. Jamal's stomach churned. The name sounded important. Official, even. He hesitated before clicking on it, his finger hovering over the trackpad. But the pull of curiosity was too strong. With a deep breath, he opened the folder. Inside were several video files, each with cryptic names like log_1 and intel_report_3. Jamal clicked on the first one, and the screen flickered to life. The video was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old surveillance camera. At first, all Jamal could see was an empty room, dimly lit and full of filing cabinets. But after a few seconds, a man entered the frame. Jamal's breath caught. He recognized the man immediately. It was the thief. The man in the video looked different, though. He wasn't nervous or disheveled like he had been in the alley. Here, he moved with purpose, flipping through the drawers like he was searching for something specific. The video cut off abruptly after a minute, leaving Jamal with more questions than answers. He clicked on another file, this one labeled Briefing. It was a recording of a voice, calm, authoritative, and unrecognizable. "We have reason to believe the data breach originated within our own network," the voice said. "If this information falls into the wrong hands, the consequences could be catastrophic. All assets are to be secured immediately." Jamal leaned back, his head spinning. Data breach? Wrong hands? What was he caught up in? He quickly ejected the USB drive and closed his laptop, his heart pounding. Max whined again, sensing his unease. "I don't get it, Max," Jamal said, rubbing the dog's head for comfort. "What does any of this have to do with me?" Max didn't have an answer, of course, but his steady presence helped calm Jamal's nerves. As the night wore on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see the thief, or someone worse, lurking outside. Every little noise made him jump, his imagination running wild with possibilities. What if the man came back for the pouch? What if there were others involved? The thought made him shiver. Finally, exhaustion overtook him, and Jamal fell into a restless sleep. But even then, his mind couldn't escape the mystery. He dreamed of the photograph, the strange code, and the voice on the recording. In his dream, the boy in the photo turned to look at him, his big brown eyes filled with fear. "Help us," the boy whispered, his voice echoing in Jamal's mind. When Jamal woke the next morning, the sunlight streaming through his window did little to ease his unease. The pouch was still on his desk, its contents a stark reminder of the night before. Max wagged his tail and licked Jamal's face, trying to pull him out of his thoughts. "All right, boy," Jamal said, sitting up. "Let's figure this out." He decided to start with the photograph. Pulling it from the pouch, he studied it more closely in the daylight. The house in the background caught his attention. It looked familiar. Not because he'd seen it before, but because it reminded him of the older houses near the edge of town, where the streets were quieter and the neighborhoods less developed. An idea struck him. Grabbing his phone, Jamal searched for old property records in Oak Ridge. It took some digging, but eventually he found what he was looking for. A house that matched the one in the photograph. It was listed under the name Lawson, Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he read the details. The house had been abandoned for years, its owners long gone. But why would the photos show a family standing in front of it, looking so alive? His curiosity burned brighter now, and he knew he couldn't let it go. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces of the puzzle still missing, and he had a feeling the answers wouldn't come easily. "Come on, Max," Jamal said, grabbing his backpack and the pouch. "We're going for a walk." Max barked excitedly, ready for another adventure. But as they stepped out into the crisp morning air, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching them. Jamal walked briskly through the quiet streets, Max trotting close by his side. The pouch weighed heavily in his backpack, its presence a constant reminder of the mystery he was now tangled in. The morning sunlight did little to ease the tension that gripped him. His eyes darted to every corner, scanning for anything, or anyone, out of place. As he approached the older part of town, the air seemed to change. The streets were narrower, the houses smaller and more weathered. It was quieter here, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. Jamal felt a shiver run down his spine as they turned onto a street lined with abandoned homes. The house from the photograph stood at the far end, its faded white paint peeling and its windows dark and empty. Max paused, his ears twitching. He let out a low growl, his body tense. Jamal froze, his heart pounding. He strained to hear what Max had picked up on, but the street was silent. "Easy, boy," Jamal whispered, though his own nerves were anything but calm. He tightened his grip on Max's leash and kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate. The house loomed ahead, its broken porch steps sagging under years of neglect. Jamal stopped at the edge of the property, staring up at the empty windows. He could feel the weight of the photograph in his pocket, the faces of the family in the picture flashing in his mind. Who were they? What had happened to them? And why did this house feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone? Max tugged on the leash, his nose to the ground. He pulled Jamal toward the side of the house, his movements insistent. Jamal followed reluctantly, his stomach twisting with unease. They rounded the corner, and Jamal's breath caught in his throat. The back door of the house was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. He stared at it, his mind racing. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still inside. Jamal's first instinct was to turn around and leave, but something kept him rooted to the spot. He needed answers. If he didn't find out the truth, the questions would haunt him forever. "Stay close, Max," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog pressed against his leg, his growl low but steady. Together, they stepped onto the creaking porch, the wood groaning under their weight. Jamal pushed the door open slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of dust and decay. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from cracks in the boarded-up windows. Jamal's eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the space. The living room was empty, its furniture covered in tattered sheets. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the draught. He took a cautious step forward, every creak of the floorboards echoing loudly in the silence. Max stayed close, his growl soft but constant. Jamal's hand brushed against the pouch in his backpack, as if to reassure himself that it was still there. As he moved deeper into the house, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker. In the corner of the living room, something caught his eye. A stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. He knelt down, brushing away the dust, to read the headline. Local Fed is a lady of the telephone lane is mysteriously disappeared from home. Jamal's blood ran cold. The date on the newspaper was over a decade old, but the names and faces were unmistakable. The man, the woman, and the little boy in the photograph. This was their story. He skimmed the article, his hands shaking. It spoke of a quiet family, well liked in the neighborhood, who had seemingly vanished overnight. No signs of a struggle, no clues left behind. just an empty house and a haunting mystery. Max barked suddenly, his sharp cry echoing through the house. Gemel jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned to see Max staring at the doorway to the hall, his body rigid. Gemel's pulse quickened as he rose to his feet, his eyes locked on the dark corridor ahead. "Is someone there?" Gemel called, his voice cracking slightly. The silence that followed was deafening. Max barked again, louder this time, and Gemel took a hesitant step forward. He felt like he was walking into a trap, but he couldn't turn back now. The hallway stretched ahead, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper. At the end, a door stood slightly open, a faint light spilling out into the darkness. Gemel swallowed hard, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he approached. The closer he got, the stronger the feeling of unease became. When he reached the door, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his breath shallow. Max barked again, the sound startling the stillness. Finally, Gemel pushed the door open. The room was small and cluttered, its walls lined with filing cabinets and shelves overflowing with papers. In the center of the room stood a desk, its surface covered in scattered documents and an old, flickering laptop. Gemel stepped inside cautiously, his eyes darting around. It felt like someone had been here recently. There were no layers of dust, no signs of abandonment. On the desk, something caught his eye. It was another photograph, this one newer and clearer. Gemel's stomach churned as he picked it up. It was a picture of him, taken from a distance. He was walking Max, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His hands shook as he set the photo down, his mind racing. Who had taken this and why? Before he could think too much, the laptop screen flickered, drawing his attention. A message appeared, its words sending a chill down his spine. "You found it, now THEY'll find you." Gemel's breath hitched. He turned, ready to leave, but stopped cold. From somewhere deeper in the house, he heard a noise, a faint creak, like someone stepping on the floorboards. Max growled, his body tense as he faced the doorway. Gemel's heart pounded as he backed away from the desk, the photo still clutched in his hands. He felt trapped, the walls closing in around him. Whoever, or whatever, was in the house wasn't far now. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, every second dragging on like an eternity. As the creaking grew louder, Gemel knew he was out of time. Gemel stood frozen in the dimly lit room, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, but his feet refused to move. Max's growl grew deeper, a low rumble that vibrated through the tense air. The creaking floorboards from somewhere beyond the room grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever, or whatever, was approaching wasn't trying to stay hidden anymore. The sound felt like a countdown, each step bringing them closer to inevitable confrontation. Gemel's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do. His eyes darted to the window, but the thick boards nailed across it made escape impossible. The only way out was through the hallway, the same hallway where the footsteps were coming from. The pressure was mounting, every second stretching painfully, and yet, as if out of nowhere, a thought crossed his mind. What if they weren't here to hurt him? What if they were after the pouch? He glanced down at his backpack, its weight suddenly feeling unbearable. The USB drive, the cryptic notes, the photograph. It was all connected to something far beyond him. And if someone had gone to such lengths to retrieve it, maybe he wasn't just in danger for stumbling across it. Maybe he was in danger for knowing too much. Max barked sharply, snapping Gemel out of his thoughts. The sound of the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their place. Gemel's breath came in shallow gasps as he strained to hear any sign of movement. His instincts told him to run, but his curiosity, his need to understand, kept him rooted to the spot. And then the voice came. "You shouldn't be here," it said, low and gruff, like it belonged to someone who had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. The voice didn't come from the hallway, as Gemel expected. Instead, it came from behind him, inside the very room where he stood. Gemel spun around so fast he nearly stumbled, his heart pounding in his chest. The desk, the cluttered shelves, the flickering laptop. All of it was the same as it had been just moments before. But now, standing in the corner, half shrouded in shadow, was a figure. A man. His face was obscured by a hood, but his posture was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. Max's bark filled the room again, more aggressive this time, as he lunged forward. But Jermel grabbed his collar, holding him back. The man didn't flinch, his focus locked entirely on Jamal. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," the man said, his voice calm but laced with menace. Jermel's grip tightened on Max's collar. "I didn't mean to take anything," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It just ended up in my backpack. I don't even know what it is." The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't need to know," he said. "But if you want to stay safe, you'll hand it over." Now. Jamal's mind raced. The pouch was what the man wanted. He was sure of it. But giving it up didn't feel like the right move. Something deep inside told him that if he handed it over, the mystery wouldn't end. It would only escalate, and he might not survive to figure out the rest. "I can," Jamal said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Not until I know what's really going on." The man's shoulders tensed, and for the first time Jamal saw a flicker of something in his posture. Hesitation, maybe even doubt. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into," the man said. "That data, those files, it's dangerous. If the wrong people find out you have it, you're as good as dead." Jamal's stomach twisted. He wanted to believe the man was lying, but the intensity in his voice felt too real to ignore. "Then why did you put it in my bag?" Jamal asked, his own voice rising with frustration. "Why drive me into this?" The man hesitated again, and this time his silence spoke volumes. "I didn't mean for you to get involved," he finally said, his voice softer now. "I was being followed. I had to stash it somewhere safe. I didn't think you'd figure it out." Jamal felt a surge of anger. "You didn't think I'd figure it out? You've got people chasing me, breaking into my house, and I'm supposed to just hand this over. What's in these files that's so important?" Before the man could answer, a new sound shattered the tense atmosphere, the sharp crunch of gravel outside. Jamal's blood ran cold as he realized what it meant. They weren't alone. Someone else was here. The man's head snapped toward the window, his posture shifting into something more defensive. "It's too late," he muttered almost to himself. "They found us." Jamal's pulse quickened. "Who'd found us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved quickly to the desk, sweeping the photograph and USB drive into his hand. "We need to go," he said sharply. "Now." Jamal hesitated, but Max's growl brought him back to the moment. He grabbed his backpack and followed the man out of the room, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. The hallway felt even darker now, the air heavy with tension. As they reached the back door, the man stopped abruptly, holding up a hand for silence. From outside it came the unmistakable sound of voices, low, urgent, and drawing closer. Jamal's stomach churned. Whoever these people were, they weren't here to talk. The man turned to Jamal, his hood still obscuring most of his face. "Stay close," he said. "And whatever happens, don't stop running." Jamal barely had time to nod before the man pushed the door open, leading them out into the overgrown backyard. The sunlight felt blinding after the darkness of the house, but there was no time to adjust. The voices were closer now, accompanied by the sound of heavy boots on gravel. Jamal followed the man as he darted toward the tree line at the edge of the yard, Max at his side. His heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder, catching a glimpse of 3 figures stepping into the backyard. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. One of them pointed in their direction, shouting something Jamal couldn't make out. The chase was on. Jamal's legs burned as he sprinted through the dense woods, Max running just ahead of him, his tail low and his ears pinned back. The hooded man moved with practiced ease, dodging branches and roots like he'd done this 100 times before. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, punctuated by the sharp crack of twigs under heavy boots. Jermel risked a glance back and saw the masked figures gaining on them. His heart raced as panic threatened to take over, but Max's steady presence kept him grounded. They reached a clearing, the sunlight cutting sharply through the trees. The hooded man skidded to a stop and turned to Jermel, his voice urgent. "We split up here. You take the dog and head west. Stay off the trails. Don't stop until you're sure you lost them." Jermel stared at him, his chest heaving. "What about you? They're after you, aren't they? If you stay." "They're not just after me," the man interrupted, his voice low but firm. "They're after what you have. If you keep moving, they'll follow you. It's the only way to keep us both alive." Jermel's grip tightened on Max's leash, his mind racing. Every instinct told him to keep running, but something about the man's words didn't sit right. He had been evasive from the start, and now he was too eager to send Jermel away. "Why should I trust you?" Jermel asked, his voice trembling. "You've been lying to me since the moment I met you." The man's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The masked figures had reached the edge of the clearing. There were 4 of them now, and one of them raised an arm, pointing directly at Jermel. "Go," the man shouted, shoving Jermel toward the tree line. Jermel hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning and running. Max barked and surged forward, pulling Jermel along as they disappeared into the thick underbrush. The sound of heavy footsteps and shouts filled the air as their pursuers split up, some following Jermel, while others stayed behind. Jermel ran blindly, his lungs burning and his mind clouded with fear. He could hear the sound of someone crashing through the woods behind him, closer than he wanted to admit. Max suddenly stopped, his body tense, and let out a sharp bark. Before Jermel could react, a figure emerged from the trees, blocking their path. "Don't move," the man said, his voice cold. He wasn't wearing a mask like the others, and his eyes locked onto Jermel with an intensity that made his stomach twist. In his hand was a small device. A radio, maybe, or something worse. Max growled, his fur bristling, but Jermel held onto him tightly. "What do you want?" Jermel asked, his voice shaking. The man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said. "Hand it over, and this can all be over." Jermel's heart pounded as he clutched his backpack. The pouch felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds now. He wanted to believe giving it up would end this nightmare, but deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't even know what's in it," Jermel said, his voice breaking. "Why is it so important?" The man's smirk faltered, and for a moment, Jermel saw something in his expression, hesitation, maybe even guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it came. "You don't need to know," the man said. "Just give it to me." Before Jermel could respond, Max lunged forward, his bark echoing through the woods. The man stepped back startled, and Jermel took his chance. He turned and bolted, Max close on his heels. The sound of the man shouting behind him only fueled his desperation. They burst through the trees into another clearing, and Jermel skidded to a stop. In the center of the clearing was a small helicopter, its blades spinning slowly. The hooded man was there, standing next to the open door, waving frantically. "Over here," he shouted. Jermel didn't have time to think. He sprinted toward the helicopter, Max keeping pace. Behind him, the shouts and footsteps were closing in. He could feel the ground vibrating under his feet, the tension in the air almost suffocating. He reached the helicopter just as the masked figures broke through the trees. The hooded man pulled him inside, slamming the door shut as the helicopter lifted off the ground. Max jumped in after him, barking wildly as the figures shouted and pointed below. Jermel collapsed into the seat, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The hooded man sat across from him, his face still hidden. For a moment, the only sound was the thrum of the helicopter blades. Then the man pulled back his hood, revealing a face that Jermel recognized instantly. It was the man from the photograph, the father. The same man who had supposedly vanished with his family all those years ago. Jermel's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. You're the guy from the picture," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, his expression grim. And I wish I could explain everything to you, he said. But right now, you need to trust me. This isn't over. Jamal stared at him, his thoughts spinning. The files, he said slowly. What's in them? The man hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. Proof, he said. Proof of something people would do anything to keep hidden. And now they know you have it. Jamal's stomach churned as the weight of the man's words sank in. The helicopter soared higher, carrying them away from the immediate danger, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. Max rested his head on Jamal's lap, his presence a small comfort in the chaos. As they flew over the endless expanse of trees, Jamal glanced at the man sitting across from him. He didn't know who to trust or what to believe anymore, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning.